is reasonably cooperative. Darren Garrett was not really crazy about seeing this, or really crazy about going through the study, and so he was pretty sullen, didn't hold his head nice and straight when we took the photograph of his teeth. What are the characteristics? He's got a fractured tooth here, so you can see there's a little bit of a gap, and you may remember that there was a gap in that corresponding area in the bite mark. His teeth are pretty flat across the front, otherwise it's a pretty well-formed arch. We can make a very simple study, just simply imprint casts of his teeth into alu-wax, which is aluminum impregnated wax, and we see that he's very flat across the front. This tooth is rotated out a little bit, just the way the bite mark was, and where his tooth is chipped in this area, it leaves a corresponding space. You'll notice his eye tooth is out a little bit as compared to the other tooth. So what have we got? If we make a simple manual drawn overlay, now there's lots of fancy ways to make overlays. This is manually drawn. There's other ways to do it with X-ray techniques that we're not going to go into. But just using a simple manually drawn overlay and using a manually drawn overlay of the injury itself, we can see there's a high degree of correlation. Now what does that tell me? That tells me that it was probably Mr. Garrett that made the mark. His lower teeth also correspond. His lower teeth are generally straight, as the mark is generally straight. So with general similarities, which we can call class characteristics, and with individual characteristics, such as his rotated upper tooth that we looked at a moment ago, and with the flatness in here and the gap caused by the chip and that tooth being out of line, I'm able to come into court and say that in my opinion, not to an absolute certainty, but to a reasonable scientific certainty, it was Mr. Garrett that made the bite mark. I'd like to close by showing you a case in which a criminalist was very, very closely involved. I'm real proud of this particular case because of the investigative work that was done and the work that was done by the criminalist that's helped me on a number of cases. I was called out to UCLA to see this child who was essentially in a terminal condition. It was a child abuse case, blunt force trauma in multiple areas of the body. The kid was essentially, the youngster was essentially dead. Now look closely at the bite mark and don't get lost. This is the top portion of the bite mark. Here's the youngster's axilla. His armpit is over here, his hand is out here. You're looking at the top portion of the bite mark. Now you're looking at the bottom portion of the bite mark. We've rotated his arm. What we looked at a moment ago is up here now. Not a very good bite mark. It just shows fairly straight teeth and some kind of scratching down here. Usual story, the suspect in the case, Mama's boyfriend, says, what a shame the kid is dead. I don't know anything about it. Oh, there's a bite mark on the body. The vicious-looking sibling must have caused the bite mark. So he's trying to hang it on the kid's sister. Well, we get the youngster in and find pretty quickly there's no way in the world that her teeny little mouth could have caused that great big mark on the baby's arm. So now we go back to the suspect and check him out carefully, and what do we find? We find he's got some spacing between his teeth and just a little bit of chipping at the cutting edge, and a little teeny bit of chipping on these adjacent teeth. Now, I wondered whether there was any chance that that irregularity could have caused those scratch marks. I didn't think so, because the irregularity is not that great, and who would expect that to leave real scratch marks on a body? On the other hand, an infant's skin is very sensitive. So I worked with Steve Dowell in our office, and I thought we might perhaps use a comparison microscope to see if we could do any striation matching. What I found was this. The suspect's teeth, his lower teeth, if I laid the cast of his teeth over this mark, it fit perfectly. So what? That's a smooth arc. There's probably 25% of the people in this room whose mouth would also fit. These are individual characteristics. Could there be any similarity? Steve made a lot of test striations and came up with this piece of wax, and we then asked ourselves, is there any relationship between these striations made by the suspect's teeth, by the cast of his teeth, as compared to the actual markings on the body? And here's what we found. I am not aware of any other case in which a comparison of this particular type has been done in bite mark analysis, which is one reason why I'm so proud of the work that Steve did. It's basically a tool-mark match, and here's an example of where a criminalist being asked to assist in a case helped not only in the original investigative process, but also in the analysis. Through recognition and proper handling of evidence, you as criminalists have an opportunity to play a most important role in collecting, preserving, and analyzing what is a potentially crucial form of evidence. I hope that this presentation will assist you in fulfilling that opportunity. Thank you very much.
You're waiting your patiently on the line.
I want to assure you when you get my focusing slide on that I picked the slide for Carol put the handout together, but we must both read Larson's cartoons exclusively. I want to start off the talk by talking a little bit about our certification or plan certification process, with the premise that whether we do shooting reconstructions or not, or do firearms examinations or not, if we call ourselves criminalists, there's an obligation, an expectation that we have an understanding of what these other specialties can provide. With that in mind, this paper is especially directed to two types of criminalists in the audience. The first would be the non-firearms examiner criminalist, who has either seen duties or subsequent decision-making duties at the laboratory as to what sort of analyses or analytical protocols are going to be carried out. The other person in our audience today are firearms examiners who presently limit themselves to what might be called platter cases, where they simply say, all I do is match bullets or cartridges to guns. I don't think you can call yourself a criminalist if that's the limitation you or someone has placed on you. I think it's Kurt. Can I get the focusing slide started? I want to get right into the slides here if I can. I think Kurt described criminalistics as the science of individualization. In shooting cases, then, our role as criminalists is to attempt to discriminate or individualize, if possible, such things as one gun from another, or possibly even all of the guns, well-aware of, one bullet from another, a bullet hole, to associate it with a particular bullet where there have been multiple shots fired, a bullet impact mark with a particular bullet or bullet type to the exclusion of others that might be involved in the case, one type of gunshot residue from another type of gunshot residue, which again may have diagnostic or reconstructive value, one gun powder or propellant, or even brand of ammunition from another. The constant question we're confronted with is there a way to differentiate the object or the material from some similar other object or material? And in the Larson slide, I just jazzed it up a little bit. You can tell the typical firearms examiner, and I include myself in that group, wears a gun around the lab, has his NRA badges, his AFTI badges, and brassards on. But the point I'm trying to make in the cartoon is, just as Dr. Vale's given us some information and from autopsy findings, Skip's talked about some trace evidence considerations. The serologists, of course, are well aware of the advances that have been made in the last decade there that may show up on firearms evidence, on the gun, in the gun, on the bullet, on cartridges, that the firearms examiner who's careless may overlook, may destroy, in fact. So there should be this interchange and understanding of each other's role and what we can do with the evidence. The first, probably 10 or 15 slides are going to be sort of a primer or re-primer of just some of the basic class characteristic information that's available to us in contemporary bulleted ammunition and shot shells. Of course, the bulleted cartridges, the thing we usually see, the bullets, but we've also got the propellant, of which there's a great variety of particular materials that are in priming composition of fixed ammunition or cartridge ammunition. And shotgun shells, while, as we all know, we can't ID the pellets of a particular gun, there's much to be said about their composition, the number of them, the size, the imprints they leave on the wads, the type of wads themselves, again, propellant and considerations in the priming composition. A little closer detail, perhaps too close, a great variety of class characteristic information in things called cantilevers that will allow us to ID brands of bullets, even from fragments of them. And of course, in centerfire ammunition, even cantilevers in the cartridge case itself have identifying features. And in shotgun shells, the older style with the various wads, fibrous wads, cardboard wads, and of course the more contemporary shells with plastic wads. And a little better slide on the great variety in class characteristic descriptions of wads that, of course, become a projectile in their own right with certain ballistic characteristics. They're very useful in reconstruction of crimes and determining range, and even certain things insofar as injury. Some examples of actual fired wads, one unfired wad, but all the rest of these have been discharged. And probably the one of most interest to me, at least, from several shootings, cases I've been involved in, is this little collar. These are easily missed. People recognize these things pretty straightforwardly. These little collars that are in most Winchester ammunition, oftentimes go unobserved or unfound. They can produce an injury at very short ranges, and the injury is very characteristic, as you'll see later in the slide. Some other changes that have taken place in shotgun ammunition in the last decade. Although a buckshot cartridge, it is the filler, the buffer, or Brex, as one company calls it. This can either be polypropylene or polyethylene. It can be either white or black. So there's two types of class characteristic information that can rule out one type of ammunition and keep another type of ammunition or brand in the offing. This material also stands to be trace evidence because it also is ejected from the gun. Just like a short-range snowstorm, will be all over the body, possibly in the wound track, up to a few feet. And after that, not to be found on the body, but it's somewhere out in front of the point of discharge of the gun, often unnoticed as just some debris or particulate that's a part of the general surrounding. But it would help establish the point of origin of the shot when it were recovered. Some other new changes, actually two are incorporated in this slide. The advent of steel shot. Magnet's not a bad thing to have in your pocket. Had a scene there. Steel bullets, now steel shot. And they are now loading shells both with lead shot and steel shot with two different sizes in the same shell. Now, 10 years ago, if any of us found that in a single wound, we would expect that there had been two blasts fired and we're looking at a composite of two discharges. That's no longer necessarily the case. Several companies now make duplex loads with lead shot, as well as this one, steel shot. This slide from one of the manufacturers, the advertisements in a gun magazine, is here just to give you an idea of the substantial diversity of class characteristic information just in one particular cartridge caliber designation, one particular manufacturer. You got the usual full metal jacketed bullets in several loadings, over here, here, and here. Several hollow point types. This is the Hydroshock type with a little peak of lead down inside of the hollow point. A nylon-coated night-clad round that Federal now makes, truncated cones, and of course the soft point truncated cone type projectiles. All straight out of just class characteristic definition and trim listings. Another new product within the last decade, Winchester's line of silver tip ammunition. Most, not all, most of these are aluminum jacketed bullets. Some are brass with a thin nickel plating on them, but right now that's unique to Winchester and will have, in a couple slides I think I'll show you later, useful information in associating this particular brand of ammunition with an injury. Quick example, say medical examiner finds just a small metallic fleck of material. Someone makes a decision at autopsy that has no rifling engravings on it. It's not useful for anything. Well, right on the first count, wrong on the second count. It turns out to be an aluminum fragment. We can now associate that with this ammunition rather than, say, a Remington round that people may have fired, or Federal or IMI from Israel, because no one of those companies are presently making aluminum jacketed ammunition. And again, just sort of a quick collage of typical things from casework. Several 9mm round. This one's interesting because of the black tip on, which may survive terminal ballistic damage. That's a high-pressure round that intended for use in submachine guns only, made by the Israelis. Here's another night-clad round, a lead bullet, but it's got a nylon coating on it. This one I've seen twice. I would have never believed I would have seen either instance. There was only about 14,000 rounds of this ammunition made in 1942. There was a shooting here in Orange County that involved this ammunition. Looks pretty normal. That's a 38 special cartridge. One up in Nevada. The Nevada case is the first instance I saw encountered the ammunition. As most of us who are gun types know, a 38 special round, whether it's a jacketed bullet or not, will have a camel lip under here, which to crimp the cartridge case. This bullet, full metal jacketed bullet, has no camel lip. You have to look long and hard to find a 38 special round with that type of projectile. But more importantly, it looks like a copper jacketed bullet. It is not. That's a steel bullet. That's also quite unusual. with a thin copper plating over it. This is the current Soviet round that's being used in Afghanistan there, Model 74. And it has some interesting ballistic characteristics. This is a friend, Jeff Schaefer, not Steve, Jeff Schaefer back in Ohio, sent me. This is Maxim Auto Protection's product line, one of their product lines. This is a 9mm Parabellum, or 9mm Luger, as you might call it, with a sectioned cartridge. It is a machined copper bullet. This is a steel BB, a Daisy in this case, an air rifle BB, .175 diameter. This is a Benjamin lead pellet sitting on top of it. This is a little plastic nose cap, just so it will feed through the action of an autoloading pistol. Imagine finding this thing splattered in a crime scene or removed from a body at autopsy. My point in this particular type of slide is there's going to be something new next week and the next week after that. And I do not have an expectation that any of us here in this room, be included, remain aware of everything that's happening in this particular industry. But that new things will be out there, and seeing something odd as this is from an actual shooting of that ammunition that took place in Ohio. The medical examiner, with the assistance of the criminalist, started pulling out these very thick copper-jacketed fragments from a very unusual injury, just a devastating wound, almost explosive in its effect on this particular individual. There are lathe marks on the base of this. Well, that's not normal in a jacketed bullet. So that was a warning right there. Again, I think most criminals would have an expectation. You see smoothly formed copper jackets, not things that have been turned on a lathe that had tool marks on them. The steel BB is mushed in this lead, and basically the pellet is semi-liquefied and just spread itself around inside the portions of the jacket. Now some other oddities. A lead ball, not terribly odd, but these are called poly patches. They're made for black powder shooters to shoot, instead of having to use a cloth patch, they just shove this object down the muzzle of their muzzle loader, and then the lead ball on top of it and flares it out in the lower picture. You can also shoot normal jacketed, and it's been suggested, normal jacketed bullets of a slightly smaller caliber from your muzzle loader. So you could end up with a 158 grain Remington 38 special bullet that's actually fired out of a 40 caliber muzzle loader where they use one of these poly patches, and it will not have any rifling engravings on it. This will have the engravings, and it will be out there in front of the point of the shooter somewhere. It's not going to be easy to find. This one's more readily known to many of us. This is the Remington Accelerator Sabot with a 22 caliber bullet and a 30 caliber sabot unfired at this point. A little closer view of it. This will take up the rifling engravings. Of course, back in this area, these petals open up upon encountering the atmosphere very quickly. This is Remington's ad a few years ago, what this would look like in the air. At close range, this is still a missile. It will produce a penetrating injury through skin and on into the body, and you'll have this six-pointed star as it goes into the body at close range. By that I mean 10, 15, 20, maybe 30 feet. After that, it's going to leave an imprint or a bruise, a contusion. It will still typically have that star shape. Finally, it's going to drop off like a booster rocket. But it, too, if we were to find a bullet badly exploded or shattered in the body that had no rifling engravings on it, there would be your tip-off that there's something very unusual, something different about this projectile. And somewhere between where that person was shot and probably fell, if they're hit with one of these, and the point of the shooter is this thing, which has so far been tan in color, and been only loaded in about 3 different cartridges, 30-30, 308, and 3006. I've incorporated a couple of things in this. Again, this is the primer group of slides. These look like bullets, and in a way I suppose they are, but I've over the years had a number of these submitted or encountered in casework from autopsy time with or without the attendance of a criminalist. And of course, criminals aren't always present when autopsies are done, as the projectile will later be compared with a gun when we find it. These are all cores. There's no rifling engravings on any of these, and that just takes not necessarily a firearms examiner, but just a person with a few moments to take a look with their unaided eye or a small hand magnifier to see that there are no rifling engravings on the area where we would normally expect to see them, such as we see on this wad cutter bullet here. These two projectiles, this one unfired, this one fired, are in this slide for a totally different reason. First of all, some very unusual class characteristics, the checkering or the knurled type texture on these Hornady lead bullets, 38 caliber. But down in the little checkering, down in the pores, if you were to buy these or see these, is a white powdery material. Right now, that is unique to Hornaday. It's pyrophyllite, which is a mineral, similar to talc, known to some of us as motor mica. That material survives the firing process. It's just pushed right down in these little checkered areas. So there would be more a trace evidence matter than anything else to verify, first of all, its texture is one particular company, and so far I believe it still is. ID under your polarizing microscope, or SIM, if you want to use a 20 millimeter Canon, that you've got pyrophyllite particles down in here. This material also ends up on the bore, on the inside surfaces of the gun barrel. It can be removed and identified. And we can look at the possible diagnostic value of that in a multiple shooter situation where we don't have a bullet in the body, but we have a wound that goes on through. But the same material that now is on the bullet, left on the bullet in the gun barrel, also will appear fairly reliably in the wipings around the bullet hole. So whether it's a bare skin shot, hopefully someone would recover a small wiping of that for possible later analysis, or a tape lift, or with clothing we're in a little better shape. If the hospital people haven't thrown it away, we could then at least associate that bullet hole through the wipings, through either polarized microscopy or a SIM, as having pyrophyllite particles bound up with the grease and the wiping. Same thing in the gun barrel of a putative gun, and of course knowing now what sort of ammunition, what brand of ammunition that's associated with it. And the wipings I'm talking about, of course, are this sort of thing. Here we can see it's pretty well built up with copper. But let's go back to the aluminum bullets. Aluminum bullets fired through the gun are going to leave aluminum wipings on the inside of this bore. If your action is to get the gun in and walk to the test area and start test firing it, that potential trace evidence is gone, shot out the barrel in all probability. And of course, lead can be present, as we all know from well-leaded barrels. We'll see a case where that was useful and important. A little bit about propellants and their class characteristics. The industry defines it a little differently, but this is sort of my own deflection of tubular or extruded powders that like little pencil grains, disc flake with a web, meaning it has a central perforation and there's a web across there. Disc flake can be made just as that, like little gray hockey pucks. Lamels, these diamond or square-shaped particles, and various forms of ball powder. So just under a microscope, some physical characterization of propellant types, which can appear in most any type of ammunition. An actual slide of what these look like more in real with a couple of historically interesting types. This is cordite from the early part of this century, used by the British in their .303 round. Of course, it's long ago obsolete. But that's, of course, nitrocellulose. All these are nitrocellulose with the exception of this. This is Pyrodex. Some Italian propellant from the Second World War, ungraphited or uncoated. Disc plate with an identifier in it. These will often survive discharge and can be found as propellant residues on clothing, some ball powders. Here's some lamels. Quick example, let's imagine a person is shot with a perforating, a through-and-through shot at fairly close range. We've got two shooters. Both of them claim they were just firing warning shots and didn't intend to shoot the person. We're never going to find the bullet. One man's shooting, they're both shooting 25 autos. One man's shooting Winchester Western ammunition. We have a spent cartridge. You can identify that with his gun. They are not denying they fired. They both fired. So in the bore of his gun, we should find, in many cases, he's shooting Winchester ammunition, ball powder. The other man, let's say, shooting Gustav Genschau, West German ammunition. The likelihood is there we're going to have lamels. If we had nothing more than a few flakes of powder around that bullet hole that were lamels, we can rule out the man whose spent cartridge is a Winchester cartridge with ball powder residues, if it's been adequately collected and protected. And with that limited population of two choices, say that it had to be this man's gun or discharge that caused the injury. The vestige of propellant types are sometimes even printed in the base of the bullet. In this situation, you can actually see that this propellant had a web, had this central perforation, because these little particles had their ends turned toward the base of this .30 caliber carbine bullet. This is still an unsolved case in Phoenix that I worked on many years ago. This bullet is made by Hornaday. It was not at that time, it was loaded in Frontier ammunition, but they had always loaded it with ball powder. It looked like it took a little miniature ball peen hammer and beat the back end of this bullet. They had never loaded it with an extreme extruded powder. So we now knew it's their bullet, but it has to be in a hand-loaded round. The dimensions of this propellant were rather unusual, and I forgot now if this is 4227 or 21. I think it's 4227. There was one commercial reloading manufacturer in Phoenix that had loaded 600 rounds of this in 30 carbine with 400-day bullets with 4227. Let's just assume that's the propellant type. And they had the customers they sold it to, 6 people. All, of course, knew over 30 carbine because that's what this ammunition was. And none of them produced a 30 carbine that we could match to the bullet. This was one of these shots that came from about a mile away and struck a person in the park and fell over dead with the bullet barely in their head. So it's still unsolved, but just the recognizing that this is interesting and unusual. You might see this at the scene or later at the laboratory. What diagnostic value does it have? Does it set these bullets apart from what we would normally expect to see? If you don't appreciate that there are different types of propellant and they aren't equally used, then you would miss something like that and its potential value. This is somewhat proprietary information. The industry probably wouldn't like let out, but I've given it to a couple of people. I do civil work for some of the companies, and this is the formula for all the centerfire ammunition as of '87. Notice the usual things we look for. Lead stiff nade, either basic or normal lead stiff nade after it's fired, we'll never know the difference. Barium nitrate ammo, no big deal. But if we go down in here, here's PETN. That's unique to Winchester. Tetracines in all of them. Aluminum powder in CCI, in Remington, but not in Federal, and in one of 2 variants. Sorry, Lauren, I didn't give you this other recipe the other day. Winchester has it in one and not the other. And nitrocellulose in a priming mixture in Federal, but not the others. Pursuing that line of unique characteristics in residues, here's 2 things I've incorporated in one slide. This is a very unusual bullet. Right now, CCI is the only company that's making this sort of thing. It's a jacketed bullet. It's totally jacketed. There's no exposed core or lead, and it's not just a thin veneer plating. It's a substantially thick jacket that is electrodeposited. So the union between the lead and the copper, if we were to cross-section one of these things, is going to be different than what we see if you just squished or swedged some lead down in the core of this bullet. So imagine this thing breaking up. It could still be identified as a CCI bullet by certain microscopic characteristics and manufacturing procedures. 38 special cartridge, glued case. This is now becoming in the public domain. It is a lead-free, barium-free, antimony-free primer. None of the things we look for are present in this. Lauren's run some of these. I ran some over at Phoenix after that. Here's just a couple of slides of the SEM EDX work. The particles look unusual. They're very foamy looking for the most part. And when you look at the EDX readout, the zinc, the gold is from the plating process. Zinc, one of the explosives is zinc peroxide in these primers. Another particle from CCI, again, unique to their company, a very foamy, looks like a sponge particle. And in this one, we not only see zinc, lots of zinc, but manganese. Manganese dioxide is another inorganic that's present in this particular company's primer and is unique to their product. And here's one of the more interesting parts. Very euhedral, lots of cleavages, structure on it, manganese. So this is part of the manganese dioxide composition. There are some organics in this, but of course not likely we'll find them in gunshot residues. Again, how would we use it? Let's say we've got a shooting and 2 choices. Some gunshot residue, but the bullet's lost and gone forever. We can see these residues in the gun of the shooter, cartridge cases, match cartridge cases to gun, or at least find the residues still in the gun, and find them around the wound or in the bullet wipings. Don't even have to necessarily have powder deposits or aerosol type deposits, but we've got the bullet wipings to work with because all this material is going to smudge on the bullet even at a clean bore shot. The point of this slide is keeping aware of the literature. Not that you're going to run off and run these analyses, but just knowing that, here's something new. When I see articles like this, and I call your attention down to these compositions as I talk, characteristic elements of the primer particles. It's an Israeli article, or Israeli writers, in our next to most recent journal, Forensic Sciences. Some Soviet ammo that has antimony, all right, but tin and mercury. It's an old mercury type primer. This is modern ammunition. And here's some more Makarov, that's their 9mm sidearm. Lead bullet, core is lead. tin and mercury. And this one's some tin, and here's one from IMI, Israeli Military Industries, copper-jacketed 9mm bullet, potassium and chlorine. It's a perchlorate type primer. If you go back and look at this article, they're finding these particles physically embedded in the base of the bullet. That's what the whole article's about. They're embedded in the base of the bullet. They stand to be in the bullet wiping materials also. It could be a way to exclude certain types of ammunition and include others from a trace element analysis approach. Some of the things I think any criminalist who goes to the scene and encounters bullet evidence should have an appreciation of. I won't dwell on it, but just the ability to determine direction of twist, whether it's left, such as these, right, such as this, what I call a base-to-base determination. Here's a couple of examples from the handout that I use in other materials. Things you could do at the scene that are not objectionable. I'm not sure I'd bring them fully up and mash them together, but just juxtapose them without quite putting them together as the illustrations show. And with a few minutes with your firearms examiner, can show you how to do this, and very quickly, while the trail is still warm. In this example, you've got 2 full metal jacketed 9mm bullets, but there clearly has to be 2 guns involved. You're not looking for 1 gun. You cannot phase these. Now here you got 2 different types of bullets, but the rifling characteristics are indistinguishable. I wouldn't say you're only dealing with 1 gun, but I certainly have no reason to say there's 2 involved. And more subtle things, such as revolver skids. You want to spend a little more time with your firearms examiner, how you would do it. Here's a more practical example. Here are 3 bullets, and the reason I turn one of them over is it doesn't matter whether you point these things toward you or have them pointed away from you. Right-hand twist, because as you look at the rifling engravings and they go away from you, away from your navel, you're looking down on this, these are right-hand twists. They're also very interesting bullets. Gene Wolberg in San Diego gave the term zebra bullets, too. The gun that fired these has very, very deep grooves, intentionally so. It's the BPZ-70, something like that, West German HK pistol, that they cut the grooves very deep to relieve the pressures because it's a simple blowback gun. The point is, it's the only 9mm I've ever seen that produces these characteristic black scorches, because these groove impressions never bottom out. They just get scorched badly by the gases that slip by. Getting back to the point, here's a bullet that, as far as class characteristics go of the bullet, is no different than this one. But you can see a very faint land width here, much narrower than what we see over here, and it's going left. So as this goes away from you, it goes from right to left. The same ammunition involved in this shooting, but 2 different guns, presumably 2 different shooters. Okay, the premise then, AFTI's always interested in definition, so I didn't really have one for shooting reconstruction, and as most of you are aware, that's my area of special interest, so I've given you some, at least from my perspective. It's not in your handout. Incidentally, we're going to be getting to a single sheet handout in a minute, but it'll be reprojected on the screen, and I'll explain how I use it. I'd characterize shooting reconstructions, as you can read here. We're doing one or more of 6 things. Trying to determine the manner in which the firearm was discharged, the range from which the firearm was discharged, the position or orientation of the firearm at the moment of discharge, the position of the victim at the moment of impact, number and or sequence of shots in multiple discharge shooting incidents, and then sort of an other category, exterior and or terminal ballistic events. Now this little checklist that I elected to send over, you may also find useful. I often am dealing initially in cases over the telephone with investigators or usually attorneys. They want to know what all they need to gather up and get together, and they start explaining a little bit about the shooting case. I just take this form that you all have in your packet out and start highlighting certain areas with a colored highlighter. Give them a little brief verbal description and say, you're going to be getting a sheet from me that has things highlighted. Find out all the answers to those questions if you can before you have me come up there or over there or out there and gather these things up. Going to the first category, the first one, the firearm itself. If the person, and this applies, of course, equally well to crimes or accidents, but I suppose in one respect a little better to accidents, because they're not likely to be arrested. In either situation, there should be an effort. The person waives their Miranda rights, or even if it's ultimately a criminal case and their phone call to the police says, hey, I just shot my wife, it was an accident, I was going to hit the gun because I heard a prowler outside and it went off. Fine, at that point, that is not a crime, in the sense that this person's a homicide or a murder suspect, they have an explanation. Get it down, and get them committed to it. Such things as, how was the gun stored prior to the incident? Was it oiled, loaded? Get details. Constantly, I see a lack of any kind of background information on the gun. I don't have a slide for this, but I want you to use your mind's eye for a moment. This is a real case out of Iowa, as I recall. The gun had been hanging on the mantelpiece for about 40 or 50 years and never fired. It had been oiled a few times, in fact excessively. It was just dripping with oil on the outside, but the bore was rather rusted. That was very apparent even after 2 shots were fired. And the claim was that they got it down to show someone, didn't realize it was loaded, touched the trigger, it went off twice. And the person spun around in agony, and so there's a shot in the front and a shot in the back. I got even crazier ones in the repertoire for another time and a couple of beers. Around the hole in the back, in the shirt, were little particles of rust in with the gunshot residue. No such particles in the residue material on the hole in the front. Well, fortunately, at the laboratory level, and the examiner, although a firearms examiner also had an appreciation of trace evidence, and started seeing this, started asking questions. This person was still talking, so they described the history of the gun. Well, you can sequence the shots now. The one with rust around it had to be number 1. And the clean residue shot had to be number 2. It can't rust between shots. So there would be an example. How the gun was loaded and prepared. Did you slip a cartridge in manually? Did you work it through the action? That situation where the person claimed they worked the action a couple of times. You could see that there were no cartridges in the magazine. Just pointed at a friend and pulled the trigger. Yet the cartridge shows that it has magazine lip marks on it that it came up out of the chamber, or the vice versa, that it shows none. And this gun reliably produces the gun. Somebody has manually slipped a cartridge in. Would be an example of how that information would be useful. And the other things that you can read at a later time. Here's a gun from an actual case. Again, at the scene, I don't expect most of us to be familiar with how a gun has been made works. But get the story down. This was the case of the guy that heard the prowler, and he kept this pistol, Model 39 Smith, in a nightstand cabinet. He kept the magazine loaded in another location up in the closet so children couldn't get to it and so on. So he picked up the gun, not realizing it must have had a round in the chamber, stumbling around in the dark, trying to get to the closet was one story. They must have stumbled or just inadvertently pulled the trigger, the gun went off, wife screamed out, slumped over the bed. What did you do then? Well, I just threw the gun down, ran to the phone. First I held her for a moment, ran to the phone, called the police, and nothing's changed. Sure enough, the magazine's up in the closet, according to the first officer on the scene, but he didn't write it down, and he got shaky on whether that is what the person said or not. If you found this gun with a cartridge in the chamber at the scene, what would that tell you? It can't have happened that way, because it stripped a live round out of a magazine and loaded it. More importantly, you can't even fire this gun if it's factory condition without a magazine in it. This gun has a magazine disconnector. But if people don't document how it was found, and in this case went totally to hell in a handbasket, no three of the 3 officers involved had the same account of what the guy told them. It didn't get written down days later. So one wasn't sure if the magazine was in the gun or not. The guy started clamming up right away. It was just unprosecutable if it was indeed a murder instead of an accident. So pictures of the gun, how it's found, is the hammer cocked or not, is the safety on or not, you may not be able to answer those, but if it's photographed before somebody rushes in to rack the slide back to make it safe as though it's going to jump up and kill again. It needs to be done, and often isn't. When you get these pictures from across the room, you can't tell much about the gun. This was one of those fun cases where long before we had the gun, you could tell what was used. First of all, the bullet was pretty unusual. 45 long Colt, with Colt rifling engravings on it. But this was the shirt of the deceased that came over to the medical examiner's office. The first hole you see at the muzzle was the actual defect caused by the shot, a lot of blast destruction. And then these 2 slit-like holes. So this gun is the gun we later recovered. But from the bullet type, the firearms examiner was able to say we're dealing with 45 Colt. But the barrel has to be very short because these 2 slits are just loaded with gunshot residue and scorching and burning of the fibers. That's from the cylinder gap. So that it was a revolver was no surprise. But 45 long Colt with only a 2-inch barrel just doesn't come out of the factory. This was a chop job. Somebody had cut down an old 1970 Colt, and sure enough, so that was great fun. Of course, be able to put out a daily bulletin of what they were looking for before you see it. It was more just using your intellect and the physical dimensions of the defect to make that conclusion. Another novel case from crime lab days. This is a trigger guard, or a piece of it, broken out of a Ruger revolver and a pentagonal imprint of a bullet. This is a case where a Phoenix police officer shot himself with another man's gun. He came out on a prowler call, came around the side of the house at night, was confronted by a scruffy-looking individual with a gun pointed at him. So he instinctively fired, and as he did, immediately felt sharp pain. The bullet, his .38 Special Spear bullet, hit the trigger guard, pushed the man's finger, what was left of it, swung back against the trigger, firing this gun and shooting him. There is the piece of the trigger guard. There's a broken out chunk of aluminum trigger guard from the Ruger. And look at the pentagonal shape. And here's the unfired ammunition Phoenix was carrying at that time with the Pentagon hollow point. The other question was, did the citizen, wasn't a bad guy, unfortunately, he was a homeowner. He was being John Wayne about it all. And I like John Wayne, had the gun cocked. That was a single action gun. So one of the questions was, what did you do to ready the gun? His story was, I hadn't cocked it because I didn't have a target yet. That would be a safe way to handle it. But he clearly had to cock it. It's a single action gun. It can't be fired unless the hammer's been manually cocked back. Okay, the next one, location, position, orientation of the recovered firearm. Really, a couple of previous slides kind of describe that. But a good shooting scene diagram, orientation photos, close-up showing the configuration of the gun. That's, again, because we often don't know just how a gun works or if it's got a defect. But if we've got a picture of it, we can answer many questions later. Position of the cylinder and slide or bolt, sequence of cartridges in the revolver, chamber if it's a revolver. Many of these are pretty standard, but I just take the view they need to be organized so they don't get missed. So you sit down, get your cup of coffee at the crime scene, and say, is there anything else we need to do before we move that gun or check to see if it's loaded? 2 standard .45 automatics. If there was only one shot fired and the magazine is empty, in other words, the guy thought it was empty, looked at the magazine, put it back in the gun, pulled the trigger and it went off. That could happen. That gun had better look like this. If he says, I did nothing else to it, because that gun, the slide will stay back if it's an exhausted ammunition supply and the magazine is in it. Now, if you do that same event with no magazine in it, this gun will fire without a magazine. It's not like the other one. Then it should look like this at the scene. The hammer should be cocked, not down, because the slide is cycled, as it should, ejected the cartridge. Take a look at these. This Glock, this is one of the newer guns that some police agencies are starting to carry, and some citizens too. You're going to see another slide that for all the world is the same view. Notice, look at the trigger here. Keep that in your thoughts. Trigger there. It's the only way to know if this gun has been snapped, in other words, pulled again without a cartridge firing. Either an inert round or it's empty. And the minute somebody opened that gun up in the last slide to check it, we'll never know. And that could be critically important in an alleged accident or suicide case or any other type of shooting when it's left behind. Trace evidence considerations. I have to speak up a bit here, sorry. On and in the firearm, flares, I think you know what those are, have an appreciation of them. Bullet metal deposits in the bore, I talked about that earlier, you'll see a slide in a moment on that. Primer lacquer on the breech face. It was Lou Monsieri gave a paper years ago, I still remember about the lacquering material on tracer bullets in the action of the gun. It was the primary piece of evidence in associating a fire that set a forest fire. A couple of examples. There's the muzzle of a gun, and you can see a nice little ball powder particle sitting right there. Mishandling, or as my hero Jack Webb once did, a dragnet stuck a pencil in there to pick it up, totally lost and gone forever. The only time Jack ever screwed up. This gets test fired without, I routinely, for years, dry patch the bore of the gun. It's very seldom request about residues in the gun barrel, but believe me, if you don't do it, and you continue not to, it's going to become important. And that dry patch can just be folded up, and I just tape it down on my worksheet or my notepad. This slips out of focus, I suppose it is. Hard to photograph the inside of the bore and keep it all in. I put a light back in the barrel, photographed it in the dark. All this yucky stuff is biological material that often, not always, often occurs by blowback with a contact shot. And in this shotgun, nice particles of blood, nothing on the outside of the gun, because the guy's hand was wrapped around it, supporting it against his chest. The blood went all the way back down to the chamber of this 24-inch barrel shotgun. A case where bullet wipings are rather important. This man who lived through it just came back from Vietnam, this little Southwest bar, went in to have a few beers, welcome back to Stafford, Arizona. When a shooting broke out between some Indians, some black guys, some Mexicans, everybody was involved in this thing. And he hadn't got hurt too much in Vietnam, and he was pretty macho type, so his story was the intoxicated Indian fired at a black man who was trying to run through this door, had fired and missed. We later found the bullet had gone into his pool table, and chased him back in there, and this fellow, Larson, came charging over to try to disarm the man, who turned and shot him. There was trouble. Look at the pool table bullet, particularly the land impressions, the gray deposits here. Nothing on the groove impressions. Where the lands rubbed it, it's smeared with gray, which turned out to be lead. Pool table bullet. Larson's bullet, other than a little blood, nice and clean. Find out the background on the gun. The background was the man who was the shooter, who claimed that Larson was the bad guy that assaulted him, was pumping up on him, so he defended himself, shot Larson, then the black guy started getting in the act. He tried to shoot him, must have hit the pool table. Now, the gun had been used for range practice earlier that day with wad cutters, lead wad cutter bullets, so he leaded the bore slightly. Of course, we did experimental design to reproduce that. Very reliably, you could smear the first, sometimes the second bullet with that particular gun and ammunition combination. This would argue against that. This would fit Larson's story. The dirty bullet, the leaded bullet, went to the pool table and shot one, cleaning the leaded bore, shot twos at him. Those bullets went in an ultrasonic cleaner because they're yucky. To clean them up, that material may be dislodged, and that opportunity to sequence the shots lost. Exterior and terminal ballistic questions, range determinations, bullet wipings, cone fractures, deformation of bullet, shot residues, empty little pellet marks from a shooting in a case where you could just extrapolate these lines. I just used the center line of the car. I just took a wash-off type marking pen, extracted these out. This was a police picture, incidentally. The car got moved. But we could go back and find this post. This car was still there. There were some pellets that hit this wall over here. And the issue was, where did the shot come from? So I just lined these out and just do the simple trig calculation to get the orientation of this angle, reference the car. There are a lot of police pictures showing where the car was parked, so we could reposition it and just extrapolate them to the location. These wads I told you about earlier, these collars. It's a young Navajo girl that was shot by her estranged husband, who said that in the Hogan without the lights, he was just firing down the hallway to give her a cheap thrill or fun her a little bit. This is the shot into her chest. No scalloping, so close range. This little defect here, no one could quite figure out what it was. That's that collar going edgewise for about a foot, maybe 2 feet, and then it flares out very reliably and loses energy very, very fast. But it couldn't have been as described. I'm going to have to wind it up to see. I've only got about a minute left. We'll try a couple more here. Ballistic calculations. Several of us have given papers, seen papers on that, these new computer programs. This is an expanded, in this direction, flight path of a Winchester .338 Magnum projectile. The line of sight to 180 yards, which is where a young boy sitting fishing was located up in Wyoming, was basically decapitated by this .338 round. Had to go sight the gun in, or check the sights on the gun. What have you done to the gun since? Nothing. It's been at the police agency. Where was it sighted? Well, 200 yards. What were you shooting at? Of course, that was early in the police reports. He said he was shooting at a coyote that had been harassing cattle down by his stock pond, and that the bullet had to have dropped down over the hill and taken this boy's head off. So he went down to look for the coyote. Here's a kid that basically doesn't have his head hooked on anymore. The bullet had entered right there, that location just below the ear. The reconstructive aspects of this type of computation allowed one to see that through his 9-power scope, and it was still set on 9x, the crosshairs would have been about right there. sighted at 200 yards, but hitting something at 180 yards, the bullet impact is about, I think that's 0.4 inches, can't quite read it now, it doesn't matter, 0.4 inches above the crosshairs. So the kid had to be in his sights, presumably what he's done. The kid had nice coyote-colored hair. He also had a blue poplin jacket that had a bullet hole through it, too. It was up around his neck, pretty cold. The guy's just careless, not paying attention. But the bullet dropping below the hill, the kid's out of sight, just didn't fit the geometry of the scene. Terminal ballistic phenomena, I think I am going to wind it up, as I usually do. I have more slides there than I can get to. But my question then remains constant. We need to look at how can we, just sitting down, and how can we differentiate a bullet hole, a graze mark, a shot from another shot, questions about range, which shot came first, sequencing it. It can often be done if the scene's documented and the physical evidence is cared for, and we just sit back, relax, have a skull session with the serologist, the trace evidence people, the firearms examiner, and use our God-given intellects to design a strategy, an analytical protocol to answer those questions. They usually can be answered if we do those steps. Thank you. I think we're at the questions for all of this session now. Flip the lights on.
Skip still here? There it is. Do we have any questions of any of the speakers this morning? Everyone understands?
I had a question for you. Did you say you have a handout of all your slides?
No, there's a sheet with that checklist that I've come to like to use. It's in your loose binder. It's just sitting in there loose.
Oh, it is. Okay.
Okay, if no questions, one brief announcement. We got a couple over here. Go ahead.
For Dr. Mayo, some items that I have in my house do not put social security numbers on because you can't go back and trace who that belongs to. Is that same true with dentures? The marking?
If anybody didn't hear the question, it basically was that there's a problem in tracing back through social security numbers, and is that true of dentures? And the answer is yes, that can be a problem. Some investigators have told me that it's difficult or impossible to get information on a dead person, and absolutely impossible on a living person, so that is a problem. On the other hand, in our office in Los Angeles, we have had some success in tracing those. I think the basic point is that a social security number is not the best identifying number to use. Certainly a driver's license would be much better. But that's the way the law was passed in California. That's the way the law was passed in other states. We would prefer it to be driver's license, yes.
Any more questions? Okay, as far as lunch, have your lunch ticket with you.
Yeah, I just love the part of Dr. Bale's lecture. Did you go over the ultraviolet photography at all in your lecture?
Did I go over what? The ultraviolet photography?
Ultraviolet photography. No, I really didn't get into a lot of the specifics of the technique of investigation. Ultraviolet photography definitely has been used. It seems to be particularly valuable in photographing an older injury. It seems to bring out some additional detail that you might not see with conventional photography. However, I've seen some photographs with ultraviolet photography in which you see a lot of detail even on a fresh injury. So the ideal thing, I think, would be to use ultraviolet photography as well as conventional photography. But I've got to be candid with you. If for whatever reason I was able to use only one or the other, I personally would prefer to use conventional photography. But that's not to downgrade the fact that ultraviolet photography can indeed provide additional information. Why would I prefer to use conventional if I had a choice of only one or the other? Simply because I'm more confident of what I would see. I'm thinking of one particular case we had that went all the way to the Supreme Court, where I stood aside in awe of the professional photographers with the ultraviolet equipment and a lot of other fancy types of photography that were being used, and it turned out by pure chance that the photographs that I had taken were the best ones in the case. So in that particular situation, had we relied only on ultraviolet photography, we would not have done as well. But once again, ideally, yes, ultraviolet photography can be of value. And I would suggest using it as an adjunct, and we do in some cases.
Anything else? Okay, have your lunch tickets with you. Lunch is right next door. You walk out, take a right. It's the first set of doors on your right. Ron.
I've told some of the older members here that about 15 years ago I belonged to the CAC, and then I left and to broaden my horizons. I left California. I'm a native Californian, and I ended up just before going to San Diego, Montana. I was up there for 7 years. I considered myself fairly retired up there with 20 murders a year for the whole state is all we have. However, I did find myself being in charge of the state crime lab in Montana, and not knowing very much about criminalistics, I found it a very unusual occupation. I did come out of there learning a few more things about criminalistics, much of what I've always enjoyed. I'm not going to talk today about the evidence that we find in the morgue. We're all very familiar with that. But this is on crime scene. We're going to talk about what the pathologist can do out at the scene, and there will be some gory pictures. I mean, a medical examiner can't talk about showing people on the slides. I think it's interesting that we're having so many different types of people talking about their particular aspects of investigating a crime scene: the dentist, the anthropologist, the medical examiner, the criminalist. It reminds me of the teacher that was teaching the 4th grade job skills program, trying to tell the kids what different kinds of jobs were available when they grew up to be big people. And she was asking little Jimmy what his dad did. He said he was a police officer, and this is what he did. And he asked Sally what her daddy did, and he said he was a baker, and then went through all that. And she asked Johnny, she said, Johnny, why don't you tell the class what your dad does? And Johnny says, well, my dad is dead. And the teacher felt so bad because it's only the 4th grade, and it kind of depressed everybody right away. And the teacher says, how am I going to get out of this? She thought for a while. She says, well, I know what I'll do. She says, Johnny, why don't you tell the class what your daddy did before he died? And Johnny thought for a while, and he said, well, he went... The title of this lecture is The On-Scene Pathologist to Be or Not to Be. When I first arrived in San Diego, I've been down there a year since last April, they had contractual pathologists or pathologists that would come in and do the autopsies and then leave. They didn't have the benefit of a full-time pathologist to attend any scenes that law enforcement might request. So when I went down there, we did institute a 24-hour call system where a pathologist could be called to the scenes. The law enforcement have never had the benefit of this particular expertise, and indeed they almost didn't know what to do with us when we got out there. In fact, I was asked the question once that was I going to be in charge of the crime scene from now on. Well, I've never investigated a crime scene. I've investigated a lot of bodies, but I know nothing about collecting evidence at a crime scene. Indeed, none of my colleagues do either. So be careful of what you let your pathologist do or say out there. And I want to If I was talking to a bunch of physicians here, I probably wouldn't be telling these stories. I might get run out of here, but since there aren't any physicians, I'm going to tell a few stories on ourselves. Forensic pathologists make enough mistakes that we have many hospital pathologists out there that think they're forensic pathologists. They're hospital pathologists that think I'm a forensic type, but they've been in this business for so long, they've done so many coroner's autopsies that they really know what's going on. Well, let me tell you a few stories. The one pathologist in Montana that did an autopsy on a fellow that was found at the bottom of a mountain in Glacier Park, ruled to death as due to multiple blunt injuries. When the parents were notified of his death, they said, well, where is his van? The van was not found in Glacier Park. The parents said, well, he was traveling from Michigan to Oregon, and in his van, it should be around there. They thought he'd been hiking in the mountains and fallen off a cliff. That's what the law enforcement thought. Well, anyhow, they went searching for the van. They found the van in Los Angeles, and the FBI did, since this happened in Glacier Park. It was a federal case. They found the van in Los Angeles, and in the front seat of the van was a lot of blood smears. So they staked out the van, arrested the fellow when they came out to pick up the van and had the keys. They got the photographs of the autopsy from the pathologist, and I will have to give him credit for taking good photographs of the autopsy. But the FBI had them enlarged and brought them to my office and said, do you see anything on the external appearance of this individual that might indicate that there was foul play? There were 7 stab wounds in the abdomen. Even the defense attorney could recognize the stab wounds in his abdomen, and yet the pathologist refused to change his mind that these were stab wounds. He said they could be lacerations from blunt injuries. The defense attorney said, well, maybe he could have fell down on one of those famous bighorn sheep out there. So I think even the defense attorney knew that it was ridiculous. But pathologists can make these type of mistakes, and it's very, very important that you have a forensic pathologist, and hopefully a good full-time forensic pathologist available to go to some of your homicide scenes. The fact that we don't have pathologists at homicide scenes is because there's none available. There aren't very many full-time forensic pathologists across the United States. Who wants to do an extra 6 years after medical school to get a civil service job? Because that's essentially what happens. We work for the city or the county or the state if we go into forensic pathology. Very few of us are in private practice. So we do spend this extra 6 years, and we do go into civil service, those that still find forensics interesting enough. There are some forensic pathologists that are just not interested in going out to crime scenes at all. They don't feel that they need to go. I feel like I need to go. I get an extreme benefit out of going to the scene. When I'm doing an autopsy, there are things I'm reconstructing in my mind that can help me during the autopsy. Some pathologists don't want to go, but what more often happens, and I find this happening a little bit in San Diego, which bothers me, is either the deputy coroner investigator or the law enforcement officer don't feel that a pathologist is necessary. And indeed, they're right in 9 out of 10 cases, but every once in a while there's a case there that I feel a pathologist could have been of definite benefit if they had been present at that particular scene. And of course, in our office, we're very, very busy. We average 8 autopsies a day in San Diego, and we have 6 pathologists, but rotating, that means there's only 3 pathologists available every day to do these autopsies, and only 2 available to do 8 autopsies over the weekend, or 16, counting Saturday and Sunday. So we're very, very busy, and often when in other jurisdictions, not ours, when the pathologist is called, he says he doesn't have any time. Or he's a part-time pathologist, forensic pathologist. He has his regular hospital duties and doesn't have time to participate in going out to death scenes like happened in San Diego before we instituted a full-time forensic pathology program down there. And last, but perhaps not least, is if the body's gone from the scene, there's no reason to call the pathologist out. After all, I told you, we are not crime scene investigators. There's really no reason for me to be there. If I do go to the scene, I can find my observations to the body. If we're taking photographs, the pathologist should confine his photographs to the body, in and around the body. I've been cautioned in the past, and I think it's a good idea not to have the pathologist taking a bunch of pictures of your scene, particularly after some things have been adjusted. So this is a scene where the body's gone, and I come out, and there's nothing there but paramedic paraphernalia. Syringes and papers, and maybe if you want me to identify those, I can be of some help. Sometimes I'll go out to a scene after the body's been removed to estimate the amount of blood loss, whether we felt the injury had occurred at the scene and the bleeding, there's enough blood there to indicate that the individual was still alive, or could that amount of blood ooze from the body. That's about the only time where a pathologist might be of value when he's called to a scene. Now, I hope you all realize that a forensic pathologist is a licensed medical doctor. I get that question quite frequently on the stand. I am a licensed physician and surgeon in the state of California. I don't think anybody would want me to deliver any babies. It's been a long time since I've done that. But what is a forensic pathologist in the realm of medicine? Well, most pathologists consider themselves a specialist in the field of diseases of the body and what causes that disease. Like if a person has meningitis, the pathologist will culture the pus in the brain and take it to the lab and look at the lab plates and the culture plates and find out what kind of meningitis is. So he's not only made the diagnosis of meningitis, which helps substantiate the diagnosis of meningitis, but he's found out what caused that meningitis. Something like a tumor removed from the lung. Is this a primary lung tumor? Is it cancer? Is it malignant or is it benign? And if it is a malignant tumor, where did it come from? Did it come from the lung, or did it come from the breast, or did it come from the liver or some other place? That's what the hospital pathologist and the definition of regular anatomic pathology is. Now, forensic pathologist, the definition of our particular field, is the study of injuries of the body, as well as diseases. We all have to have our anatomic boards before we go into our forensic boards. But the study of injuries of the body and what may have caused those injuries. So when we look at an injury, we have to start thinking whether it was caused by a bullet, or whether it was caused by a knife, or whether it was caused by a club. And you say, well, what's the big deal with a guy shot between the eyes? Of course, it's a bullet hole, came out the back. Well, maybe it did come out the back. Maybe he shot in the back of the head and came out the front. And that's where our expertise lies, in the differentiation of the types of various injuries of the body. So when do you call us out? When do you call a pathologist to a scene? If there isn't any death investigator, many of the larger cities have sophisticated death investigators or deputy coroners. I'm talking about formally trained death investigators. I'm talking about investigators that have had a week-long course of training in death investigation. We've got a lot of death investigators throughout the country that have been trained by the fellow before them, by the fellow before them, by the fellow before them. They have really not had any academic training, and they should have academic training, because their mistakes that they've made 20 years ago, they're just passing on to the next fellow and the next fellow and the next fellow. So it's very important for all of us to support formal training for deputy coroners and for death investigators. if you have a well-trained death investigator out on the scene, many times you don't need a pathologist. He has seen injuries often enough that he may be able to interpret. Our death investigators in San Diego, if they feel that they can't make that particular interpretation, they'll call us out. And indeed, we have instituted that type of request if they're at the scene and they think a pathologist may be needed. Either the deputy coroner or the law enforcement investigator in charge can request that the pathologist comes out. So even if the deputy coroner doesn't want him there, the homicide investigator says, I don't care what you say, I want him here, we'll roll. There's one other person that can roll out on these scenes, and that's the forensic pathologist himself. There are some scenes, they may not all be homicide scenes, that we're particularly interested in, and we'll tell the deputy coroners and some of the homicide investigators that we would like to go out to these particular types of scenes. Whoops. The one other scene that I think a pathologist should be called out in, if he's available, is a police-involved case. I mean, anybody that's in police custody, anybody, whether the police was the assailant or whether the police were the victim. I think a pathologist or somebody or a pathologist from the coroner's office or the medical examiner's office should be present. It's nice to have a separate agency there. Sometimes the doctor or the physician can give it an aura of credibility that they may not accept from somebody else looking at that particular scene. When I say police custody deaths, I'm even talking about the individual that may be handcuffed and he's on the front lawn and he's being transported to the police unit and drops dead. He's 86 years old, he's had 3 prior heart attacks, maybe some open heart surgery. Still, he's in police custody and the public's going to say something might be wrong here. It'd be best to have a physician out there if he hasn't been transported somewhere, just to take a look at things and make sure that he didn't see any injuries or whatsoever on the body at the time they were out at the scene. Mega murders, that means more than 2 victims when a whole bunch of people are shot, things like what occurred down at McDonald's in San Ysidro. The pathologist should be called to that particular scene just because everything's going to get so nasty. It's best to have the medical examiner in on the very beginning of the program. And the same holds true with VIPs. You know, if the mayor is murdered, the supervisors or machine gun or something like that, it would behoove law enforcement or even the criminalists to have a pathologist out there on the scene. We don't go stomping in on all your scenes, by the way. I remember one time I trained at the IFS up in Oakland, Alameda, and I remember sitting out there in the sun for 5 hours waiting for one of the evidence technicians to finish taking some casts and some photographs of a particular scene, and there's a huge crowd of 40 people gathered around, and we all stood out there in the hot sun waiting for that criminalist, and I was new and young and dumb and saying, well, when are we going to go down there and look at the body, you know? And they said, well, when he gets finished. And back there, I don't know, maybe he may be in here or something, but it was a long-haired kid out of Berkeley, and here he's doing all this scientific stuff down there, and they said he was a brilliant individual, and we're up there waiting for him, and it taught me that I do have to wait, and all the pathologists should know that they're going to have to wait to come in on the crime scene. Sometimes you have problems with coroners, lay coroners. In Montana, we had to handcuff one of the coroners to a tree because he was a funeral director, and he wanted to get that body out of there right away so he could get it processed. And he'd done that a couple of times to the sheriff's office, and the last time they just handcuffed him to the tree and got the body out of there. Alabama, there's a deputy coroner there, as well as a homicide investigator, and obviously the pathologist is there because I took the photograph. I kind of feel in a new community, and I was the first medical examiner in Birmingham, Alabama, the first one in Montana, the first one in San Diego. I don't know why they keep sticking me in these jobs. I hope I don't get killed doing it, but by stepping on so many toes. But you do have to change things, and they weren't bagging the hands down there. San Diego, they bagged the head, the hands, the feet, but then they weren't putting them in a very good body bag. So now we're putting them in body bags and sealing the body bags to preserve the evidence a little bit better. But another thing, a pathologist at the scene, he can maybe confirm some of the things that he's seen at the scene, like if this fellow did have $2,500, he could see the deputy coroner and the homicide investigator counting out the money, and when the family says there was $7,500, they may not believe the police, and they may not believe the coroner, but maybe they might believe the physician. I mentioned to you that some of the pathologists like to be called on certain types of death. I have warned all the deputy coroners that if there are any explosive deaths in San Diego, that I would like to be called on those, because I've been involved in 6 different cases where people have been killed by explosives, and you don't see that many pathologists that have done that many cases. I was surprised that we had 2 of them in Montana, but they can be very tricky cases to deal with, and the presence at the scene can sometimes help you figure out what you're removing from the body. In Birmingham, or in Bessemer, Alabama, a police commissioner's sergeant opened up a package on his desk, and it was a mail bomb, and it blew the police sergeant's hands off. It killed the police sergeant. Blinded the police commissioner. The body was sent to Birmingham, where I did the autopsy, and during the autopsy I was pulling out pieces of wood and pieces of green felt, and I'm assuming that the wood was from the desk, and that the felt, maybe some of that felt you see under mirror or under glass sometimes on a desk. We also pulled out bits of metal and wire. But since this was a post office case, the post office was in charge of the investigation, and all this evidence was turned over to the post office. Well, from this evidence, they were able to reconstruct the bomb, and it wasn't pieces of wood from the desk or fell. It was a gun box that somebody had a gun or a replica of a gun in a kind of a commemorative box. And there's actually pieces of Radio Shack fuse or wires in there, and one of their little trigger devices. I don't think it was a mercury switch, but anyhow, the post office was able to reconstruct this from material that they found that I found at autopsy, and of course that they found at the scene. But I would have made that mistake of thinking it was a piece of the desk. If I had been to the scene, it might have saved me a little bit more time and kind of made me think a little bit more about what I was taking out of the body. Well, by the way, this was a car that we blew up. We blew up a bunch of cars down there in Birmingham. We were still allowed to do things down there, right in town. Neighbors were complaining and everything, but the police just didn't care about it. And we put the bombs in different parts of the car. We put it on the steering column and underneath the seat and then against the firewall. And in those days, the pound supplied us with some dead critters that we were able to x-ray and see what types of material we were going to find inside the bodies when they were placed in different parts of the car. Those were the good old scientific study days. Nowadays, if you do something like that, you're going to make the Inquirer headlines. doctor blows up dogs. But then we have another pathologist that likes to go out to burn scenes, and so he's called out to arson. It might be an arson death, and maybe just an accidental death. This is a photograph I took in Oregon where we had a burn to learn type of setup, which I found very interesting. I learned a lot about fire and combustibles and accelerants in this particular session. And these are the things that I feel medical examiners could really benefit from. And I'm sorry to see that we don't have much more medical examiners involved in the criminalistic society here in California. This is just to talk about police custody deaths and deaths involving the police. These can be very critical. We had a SWAT team killing in Escondido just after I arrived in San Diego, and there were something like 37 different holes in this fellow. He was been shot with handguns and long guns and shotguns, and it's important to recover all the material that you can from the body, and indeed every single piece of lead was removed from the body. I don't know how many. It took me 3 days to enumerate all the entrances and exits and try to make some kind of sense out of where he was shot and by what. But nevertheless, the city is still getting sued for this fellow that comes out dressed in a full camouflage outfit, runs out of the apartment and starts shooting at all the cops. And of course they retaliate. And yet that somebody is suing the city on this particular case right now. I don't know what for. Mega murders, says just when you have more than 2 people that need to be autopsied, I think the pathologist should be called to the scene. What can a pathologist do at the scene? Our main job as a forensic pathologist is to determine the cause of death, the manner of death, sometimes helping them determine the time of death, and the other 2 things are identification of the body. Nowadays in San Diego, when I get a bag of bones, it's nice I can turn them over to the anthropologist. Many forensic pathologists don't have that luxury and have to do some of their own skeletal identification. Indeed, in Montana, one time I had to identify all the animal bones. They were always sending me buffalo bones. Doctors were sending me buffalo bones and asking me if they were human. And of course, we have elk bones and deer bones and all that kind of stuff in Montana. It reminds me of one story where during hunting season, people skin their animals and then take them home and cut off the legs and everything, and throw them out to the dogs. And so it's not uncommon at all to see dogs running around. In fact, my own dog brought me home a deer skin, a nice elk antler, brought me a horse skull with a tooth, which I still have. The dogs get these things and bring them home. Well, the one time they called up the crime lab and said, the lady called up and says, there's a dog running down the street and it's got a human arm in its mouth. And the secretary says, well, ma'am, it's hunting season and you don't really have to, it's probably a deer leg or something like that. She said, but there's a wristwatch on it. I hope I didn't steal any of your material. But determining the cause of death at the scene can be very, very helpful to everybody concerned. I particularly think it may help the criminalists more than it helps the homicide detectives. Because the homicide detective, if he thinks it's a homicide, he's going to have the criminalists go round, and if there's a scene technician out there, he's spending 2 days out there, if it's a homicide. Well, it may not be a homicide, and often the pathologist can not very often tell the investigator that, hey, that's a homicide, that's a suicide. It's usually the homicide investigator says, we're pretty sure this is a suicide, Doc. What do you think? And I'll say, there's no doubt in my mind it's a suicide. And then he says, okay, everybody go home. We'll let the coroner wrap up the body and take it on in. That's where I think we could be of good service. And our time is very, very valuable. And if you can't get a pathologist out to the scene on something like that, it can save us all a lot of time and money. Now, I've had personally 3 or 4 cases like this that were first described as a homicide. And this is either a man or a woman found naked in their house with bruises all over the body, and there's blood all over hell and back in the place. And in Alabama, the police officer told the papers that this was the most brutal beating he'd ever seen. But as a pathologist, the thing that tips us off at the scene, if we're called to the scene, is the presence of a bunch of beer cans and bottles and booze. And this person is an alcoholic that has such a bad liver that they aren't able to clot the blood normally when they bump into something. Of course, they're staggering around in the house, bumping into the kitchen sink and stumbling over the coffee tables and falling off the toilet and whatever, and sustaining all these injuries that do look like somebody has beaten this person to death. And there's blood all over the scene. And the blood is from the vomiting, from the gastric ulcers or esophageal varices, whatever they have, and so it's usually confined into and around the kitchen sink or into the bathroom, and the pathologist can make a quick assessment that we're probably dealing with somebody that has a very severe degree of cirrhosis of the liver, and this is a natural death and not a brutal beating. In the manner of death, the cause of death, of course, is to be differentiated from a manner of death. The cause of death is like a gunshot wound to the head. But the manner of death could be self-inflicted, it could be homicidal, it could be accidental, dropped the gun and went off, or it could be undetermined, we don't know what it is, we know it isn't natural. But let's look at the manner of death. This is a case when I was working in San Bernardino of a 16-year-old kid that knocked on the neighbor's house early in the morning on the back door and saying, my house is on fire and my mom and my sister are still in the house. And the neighbors looked out there, and indeed the house was almost totally engulfed in flames. As a matter of fact, by the time the fire department got there, the whole interior had been gutted. One of the members of the fire department thought he may have smelled an accelerant, and they called the pathologist out before they had even finished putting out the fire. That's when I bought myself one of those white helmets so I could wear it in these scenes, because these burning brands were falling down in my collar at the scene. But I actually went out, and the house was still smoking, and they took me to where they thought one body was, and indeed in the living room we find this individual. This is the skull or the head. You can see the body's almost totally incinerated. And they were asking me if I thought there was any evidence of foul play. Well, looking at the skull, I could see there weren't any bullet holes in it, but I really didn't think I could be of any help until we rolled the body over. And what we've done is we've rolled the body over this way, and here is where the body lies. And there's some sparing of the buttocks and the shoulders of this individual. Here's the head and the arms, most of which have been burned off, and the legs down here. But we do see some blood on the clothing, and we do see some injuries on the back. And this is a closer view. They're both stab wounds. There's a couple of stab wounds here too, which are very hard to see after burning. As a matter of fact, bodies that are charred like this are always x-rayed, because there's no way we can tell whether this is a knife wound or a bullet hole or whatever. So I was able to tell right then and there at the scene that we're dealing with a homicide. When we found the daughter, this is in the autopsy room, we were able to see all these stab wounds on her. I forget how many she had. She had some defense wounds. And so then we did confront son with a fact, and he said that he'd stabbed his mother and sister to death and poured gasoline all over everything and set it on fire. But there's some evidence that was still preserved at the scene by making sure that we had a homicide right there. Many times the investigators call me out hoping that I'm going to say, nah, this isn't a homicide. You know, he fell into the cactus or something, and that's why he got all these holes. But there are a few cases where I am called out, and I say, yes, indeed, this is a homicide. Now, this case was a elderly gentleman in a Veterans Administration hospital where they get all sorts of excellent care. He's found in bed with all these stab wounds in his chest, just to orientate you. This is his armpit, and this is a thoracotomy wound. He survived these wounds enough that the physician was able to put a chest tube in his thorax. But he's got 72 stab wounds in the chest here, and the story was that his nephew came in and found his uncle with all these stab wounds in his chest and called the nurse to come in and call the police. So police come out and see all these stab wounds, and they see the knife, and they ask the nephew whose knife it is. The nephew says, "That's mine. I gave it to my uncle the day before because he wanted to peel an apple with it." And they said, "All right." Started reading him his rights and put the handcuffs on and took him away. And when the body came into me, they told me that story, and somebody said, "Could these wounds be self-inflicted?" And the answer is yes. And as a matter of fact, these are self-inflicted stab wounds. 72 stab wounds in the chest. Only 3 of these wounds actually entered the chest cavity. Most of them are superficial. Maybe you've heard of the hesitation wounds that suicide or people that are committing suicide by slashing their wrists. They hesitate a little bit before they make a deep cut. They nick themselves to see how much it hurts and how much it bleeds. And they'll say, "Well, that didn't hurt too bad, but it doesn't bleed very much." And they cut it again. They say, "Hey, that's better." And then they say, and so we will usually almost always see hesitation wounds on self-inflicted injuries. Well, most of these were into the ribs, and he's hitting his ribs, and once in a while he'd get into the intercostal space in between the ribs. Ah, that was a good one. And then he gave himself a few more licks. But you could tell by the orientation of most of these wounds that he is holding the knife in a pattern, and the knife is consistent with him holding it with his right hand while I'm stabbing himself in the chest. And also another fact is they're all in a certain area here. People that are usually stabbed homicidally, the wounds are random, helter-skelter all over the body. Now, just a quick thing about the time of death. I'm not going to get into any deep discussion on that other than it's still not able to be accurately determined. So what I wanted to talk to you a little bit about the value of rigor mortis, which obviously this infant is in, and this demonstrates about the only value of rigor mortis, and that is we can use it to tell when the body has been moved. Obviously, this child did not die in this particular position. The body has been moved, the arm and the leg are still up like that. So this is about the only real value of rigor mortis. Livor mortis has just about the same value. Livor mortis, as you know, is a gravitational pooling of blood into the dependent parts of the body after death. Such as we actually have a line right here where the blood is settled out into the posterior aspects of the body here. Well, if somebody turned this body over and we found it at the scene, we see all the lividity or livor mortis on the other side, we know the body's been moved. A good example is when they cut Granddad down in the garage and drag him in, put him in bed, and say that he's died from a heart attack. And the coroner comes out there and see his legs are all purple, and then he just goes out in the garage and you can see where the rope's been cut. And they just cut him down because they didn't want anybody to know that he committed suicide. Algor mortis. Rigor, Livor, and Algor are the Mortis brothers. Algor is the temperature of the body after death, where the temperature of the body declines after death, and trying to accurately estimate the time of death by taking liver temperatures or rectal temperatures. I think the most accurate way is to drill a hole into the skull and stick a thermometer in there, into the bony box of the skull, and take temperatures after death. Have to be corroborated with environmental temperatures, and then they should also be taken frequently enough that you can get a linear curve, and then you come up with some answer that's probably wrong. We'll testify in court that the individual had been dead at 6 o'clock, and they'll bring in all sorts of telephonic messages that he was talking to people at 7 o'clock. So it's full of hazards, and don't ask your pathologist to determine the time of death. What we try to do for the investigators is to corroborate the temporal relationships. You know, they said, well, the TV was on. Do you think he was live last night, Doc, watching TV? And we'll say yes. Or we'll say, no way. He couldn't have been alive watching TV last night for some reason that we find at autopsy. Another thing that the pathologist can do besides at autopsy and the recognition, collection, and preservation and handling of evidence is, which is going to help you, is it's always nice to have an extra pair of eyes at the scene. I can't tell you how many times attorneys that have been at autopsies have found pieces of evidence on the body that aren't really trained criminalists. We do have criminalists, we're fortunate enough to have criminalists in San Diego that come and collect evidence from the bodies in the autopsy suite. But in Montana, I was the one that collected the evidence. I scraped the nails, I did the GSR, and I don't know anything. And so it's important to have somebody there that knows something about what's going on. Bullets are changing every day. And Lucian says, and it just bothers the heck out of me on the interpretation of gunshot wounds. We do have a portable rolling microscope that we roll over the bodies now, and we can take photographs of gunshot wounds, and we do help the evidence technician collect the powder around the wounds, which is something that we never did before. And nowadays, when you don't have any bullets, I learned up there in Montana, everybody gets shot with a rifle and slugs in the next county. So I've learned to collect powder in Montana and give it to the firearms examiner. There are things at the scene that we can see that you may not recognize. These are drug tracks or needle tracks, so if we do have a death, we can say it's dope related. If we look at the insides of the wrist, we may see healed, overlapping transverse scars that may indicate that the individual has previously committed suicide, and that may substantiate or previously attempted which may substantiate our thoughts that this person has OD'd this time. The presence of petechia in the eyes, most commonly seen in heart attacks, by the way. Those of you who think this is a hallmark of asphyxiation, it is a hallmark of asphyxiation, but we see it more often in heart attacks than we do in people that have been manually strangled. But if we see bruises on the neck and petechiae, these little red dots, pinpoint hemorrhages on the inside of the eyelids, and even up around here. Marks on the neck and these in the eyes, that is manual strangulation until proven otherwise. Investigation of child abuse and deaths. We called out on this, and they thought it was a SIDS death, a sudden infant death syndrome. The pathologist at the scene looked under the lip and saw hemorrhage where the child had been previously punched in the mouth. We saw evidence of a previous old cigarette burn on the palm of this child's hand. And sometimes we can see injuries at the scene that may indicate to us what type of weapon has been used. And in this case, we had a belt buckle, and it matched perfectly with the injuries on this child. Some of the injuries that can be misinterpreted are these abrasions on the neck post-mortem. People might think this person was throttled, but these were caused by ants. Ants cause these kinds of changes. Here's some insect activity on a child stinger. Somebody may think that's child abuse. And light sprays. Did you want to have questions? Mr. Brown told me that the way we're running it, instead of having questions afterwards, that I have a few minutes, I can entertain questions right now for any of you that may have. Yes.
Why do you find petechia in a heart attack patient?
Well, petechiae are caused by what some people think are just chemical changes that go on when the brain becomes hypoxic, and that these chemical changes cause the capillaries to release a little bit of blood. So in a heart attack, everybody dies from hypoxia one way or another. Shortness of breath, as my grandmother used to say. And when a person's heart stops, of course, the blood to the brain, the supply to the brain ceases, and then the brain supposedly secretes a chemical that causes the capillaries to leak. Yes, sir.
The pathologist would like to go to the arson scenes. Was he usually the first person on the scene?
The question was a pathologist would like to go to the arson scene, was usually the first one at the scene? No, we're never the first people at the scene. And there's been many times we've had to wait for the criminalists.
Yeah.
Yes, sir.
You mentioned that in some cases the pathologist would like to be there at the scene and would contact the deputy coroner or whoever. If they would turn you down, would you have the authority to go ahead and go roll on it anyway?
You bet. You bet. I think the pathologist should be allowed to go to any scene he wants to, because I think the best benefit of the pathologist going to the scene is the benefit to the pathologist himself. It really helps me answer a lot of questions during the autopsy because I've been to the scene before. It just puts everything together often. Yes, sir.
Did you do anything concerning the collection of vitreous or the iron concentration for your death?
At the autopsy table, we never do any invasive body procedures at the scene. But at the autopsy table, almost routinely, we take vitreous humor. The chemical that you're talking about is potassium. Potassium at one time was thought to linearly increase with the time after death. Since that time, we found that it doesn't do that. So we don't routinely do a potassium on a vitreous, especially in Montana, because we found that cold really retards the production of potassium after death. So there's a very high temperature variable in that particular analysis. Well, thanks very much. I really appreciate being invited to come and talk to you.